From there, we will drift seamlessly into the hidden, peaceful embrace of the Valley of the Kings, resting safely beneath the protective shadow of silent, sloping desert mountains. Here, the quiet earth holds the warmest, most tranquil secrets of a world forever bathed in soft amber and dusky gold. If you find comfort in these slow, winding journeys, please consider gently tapping the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your quiet support helps this little sanctuary grow, allowing us to continue weaving these restful dreams together, night after night. So, wrap yourself in your warmest blankets, close your eyes, let your breathing find a slow, natural, and steady rhythm. And let's begin this slow and soothing journey. As the modern world fades entirely from your mind, imagine stepping onto soft, warm sand that cradles your feet perfectly with every step. A soft, twilight breeze brushes against your skin, carrying the faint, sweet scent of lotus blossoms from a distant, slow-moving river. Ahead of you, rising from the dusky golden earth, the magnificent silhouettes of an ancient temple complex begin to appear, glowing softly under the emerging light of 1,000 silver stars. We are arriving at the threshold of profound stillness, entering a place where time itself has gently fallen asleep. The journey begins along a quiet, sweeping avenue lined with serene stone guardians, gently resting under the indigo blanket of the night sky. These are the watchful sphinxes, their smooth, weathered faces holding the quiet wisdom of thousands of peaceful years. They sit in perfect harmony, a calming rhythm of stone that guides our slow footsteps toward the immense, welcoming heart of Karnak. With each step along this ancient path, the air feels softer, wrapping around you like a warm, comforting shawl. The ground beneath is a tapestry of crushed sandstone and stardust, absorbing the gentle weight of your body, urging your weary muscles to finally let go. The sphinxes seem to hum with a low, resonant frequency of deep earth and quiet devotion, their silent gaze encouraging a profound, unshakable stillness within your mind. We drift further down this sacred walkway, moving seamlessly toward the grand, towering pylons that stand as open doorways into a vast realm of endless, gentle dreaming and eternal slumber. Passing through these colossal, sheltering gates feels like stepping softly into another dimension, where the rushed pace of the modern world simply ceases to exist. The massive stone walls rise high into the velvet darkness, casting long, velvety shadows that embrace the quiet courtyards in deep, protective comfort. As you look up, the sheer scale of these magnificent structures inspires a deeply soothing sense of awe, making all earthly worries feel beautifully small and distant. The stone itself radiates a residual golden warmth, having gently absorbed the bright, nourishing sunlight throughout the long, lazy afternoon. Now, in the quiet hush of the evening, it slowly releases that comforting heat back into the crisp night air, creating a perfectly balanced, cozy atmosphere all around you. The soft, ambient glow of the moonlight traces the edges of ancient weathered carvings, turning the solid architecture into a delicate, luminous painting. We wander effortlessly deeper into this tranquil sanctuary, guided entirely by the gentle, silent pull of ancient starry wonder. Just ahead lies the breathtaking expanse of the great hypostyle hall, a mesmerizing forest of colossal stone pillars that seem to hold up the very fabric of the night sky. Wandering into this monumental grove of columns feels like drifting into the deep, rhythmic breathing of the ancient earth itself. Each massive pillar is completely covered in beautiful, flowing hieroglyphs that look like soft, rhythmic ripples on the surface of a quiet, undisturbed lake. The sheer size of these pillars creates a feeling of absolute safety and profound sheltering, as if you are being gently cradled within the strong, protective ribs of a sleeping giant. The spaces between the columns form narrow, tranquil pathways of silver moonlight and deep, restful shadow, inviting your eyes to lazily follow their winding, mesmerizing patterns. The air in here is wonderfully still, carrying only the faintest, sweetest whisper of history. You feel an overwhelming urge to simply pause, breathe slowly, and let the quiet majesty of this place wash over you. Gazing upward toward the towering, flared capitals of these magnificent pillars, You notice they are delicately shaped, like beautiful, blossoming papyrus flowers, gently unfurling in the cosmic dark. The ancient architects designed this vast, tranquil hall to mirror a primordial sacred marsh, a place of ultimate creation, stillness, and perpetual renewal. In the soft, silvery illumination of the moon, these massive stone flowers appear to sway ever so slightly, breathing in quiet unison with your own slow, steady inhales and exhales. The missing roof allows the brilliant, shimmering tapestry of the Milky Way to serve as the ultimate ceiling, dusting the tops of the columns with a fine, glittering frost of starlight. It is a profoundly calming realization to know that these very same stars have watched over this quiet sanctuary for countless peaceful centuries. Your mind floats effortlessly up toward that cosmic canopy, feeling wonderfully light, untethered, and entirely at peace within the vast echoing silence of this deeply magnificent ancient stone forest. Moving closer to one of the giant, sheltering columns, you reach out to gently trace the smooth, sweeping lines of the ancient carvings with your fingertips. The sandstone is exquisitely cool to the touch now, yet it retains a soft, comforting resonance, like the muted hum of a beautifully tuned instrument. Every elegantly carved bird, every perfectly rounded sun disk, and every serene face is a testament to a quiet, meticulous patience that spans entire lifetimes. These beautiful symbols are not merely writing, they are frozen poetry, delicate melodies captured forever in the tranquil, patient medium of solid stone. As your hand glides over the shallow grooves, you can almost feel the gentle, dedicated rhythm of the artisans who shaped them, their slow, mindful work echoing through the long, peaceful corridors of time. This tactile connection grounds you, pulling your awareness entirely into this soft, unhurried moment, allowing your heavy eyelids to flutter and droop under the soothing weight of such beautiful, timeless harmony. Drifting smoothly past the sprawling forest of pillars, a solitary, breathtaking needle of rose granite rises gracefully into the deep indigo heavens, pointing endlessly toward the resting stars. This magnificent obelisk, wonderfully carved and polished to a smooth, mirror-like finish, stands as a quiet, towering beacon of absolute serenity in the heart of the great temple. Its perfectly shaped pyramidal peak was once coated in a brilliant, shining alloy of gold and silver, designed to catch the very first tender blush of the morning sun. Now, in the deep, restful embrace of the night, it catches only the gentle, pearlescent glow of the descending moon, reflecting a soft, ethereal light that bathes the surrounding courtyards in milky radiance. The obelisk seems to anchor the drifting clouds, tying the gentle earth to the vast, peaceful cosmos in one harmonious, unbroken line. Looking at its perfectly balanced, slender form, your own body feels completely aligned, deeply relaxed, and perfectly centered within the quiet stillness of the sleeping world. We float effortlessly toward the calm, reflective expanse of the temple's sacred lake, a perfectly rectangular mirror, resting quietly at the edge of the monumental ruins. The water here is completely undisturbed, a deep, tranquil pool of liquid obsidian that perfectly duplicates the breathtaking, starry sky above. Standing by the soft, grassy edge, you can see the shimmering constellations softly undulating on the smooth, glassy surface, gently blurring the boundary between the quiet earth and the endless heavens. The ancient priests would quietly bathe in these very waters, seeking absolute purity and peaceful clarity before the soft dawn broke across the golden horizon. You can almost hear the faint, soothing sound of water gently lapping against the ancient stone steps, a hypnotic, rhythmic lullaby that effortlessly lulls your mind into a state of profound, floating tranquility. The cool, refreshing moisture in the air gently settles on your skin, washing away any remaining whispers of wakefulness, leaving only a pure, deeply refreshing sense of inner peace. Near the quiet edge of the mirrored lake rests a massive, beautifully smooth scarab beetle carved entirely from deeply luminous pinkish granite. This gentle, rounded monument represents the quiet, eternal cycle of rebirth and the beautifully slow, steady turning of the cosmos. Its smooth, polished back reflects the gentle moonlight, looking almost like a large, comforting gemstone dropped softly from the velvet sky. Beside it sits a wonderfully serene, small alabaster sphinx, its features softened perfectly by the gentle, endless caress of passing winds and shifting sands. The milky white stone of the Sphinx glows with an inner ethereal warmth, offering a quiet, reassuring presence in the dusky shadows of the temple grounds. Together they form a deeply peaceful tableau, silent guardians of the night, who ask for nothing but your quiet, restful presence. You feel a profound kinship with these incredibly ancient resting forms, feeling your own breathing sync beautifully with the slow, eternal heartbeat of the vast sleeping Egyptian desert. We drift slowly inward, arriving at a deeply unique and strangely comforting space, known entirely for its beautiful, tent-like architectural elegance. The festival hall was beautifully designed to resemble a vast, luxurious pavilion, with columns shaped delicately like massive, sturdy tent poles, reaching up to support the heavy stone canopy. This clever, beautiful design creates an incredibly cozy, sheltered feeling, as if you have stepped into a grand royal sanctuary woven from the softest, most protective fabrics. Faint traces of ancient rich pigments still cling softly to the high ceilings, revealing muted whispers of starry blue ceilings and warm, earthy red decorations. The enclosed, quiet nature of this hall creates a deeply comforting, acoustic hush, dampening all outside sounds and leaving only the gentle, rhythmic rustle of the evening breeze passing through the grand doorways. It feels wonderfully secluded, a perfect hidden cocoon where you can safely curl up your thoughts, letting the quiet luxury of the past completely envelop your resting mind. Tucked quietly away behind the grand, sheltering hall lies a beautifully intimate space, a hidden stone sanctuary dedicated entirely to the wondrous, quiet beauty of the natural world. The walls here are beautifully covered in delicate, exquisitely carved reliefs of exotic plants, soft blooming flowers, and gentle resting animals brought from distant, quiet lands. It is a wonderfully peaceful botanical garden frozen perfectly in smooth, warm sandstone, capturing the vibrant, silent essence of nature in eternal, restful slumber. As your eyes gently trace the soft, curved leaves and beautifully plump fruits etched into the stone, you feel a deep, comforting connection to the slow, nourishing cycles of the ancient earth. The artwork is so beautifully detailed and tenderly crafted that you can almost smell the sweet, earthy fragrance of these long-forgotten ancient gardens. This quiet, carved paradise invites you to simply let go of all complexities, bringing your thoughts down to the simple, beautiful, and deeply grounding rhythm of softly growing things. Slowly, we begin to gently float away from the massive, comforting embrace of Karnak, moving softly toward the great, slow-moving ribbon of the tranquil Nile. The grand temple gradually recedes into the velvety background, its towering, quiet pillars blending smoothly into the deep, dark silhouettes of the sleeping palm trees. The air grows noticeably cooler and delightfully fresh as we approach the gentle, lapping water, the true flowing lifeblood of this vast, golden desert. Small wooden feluccas are moored quietly along the soft, muddy banks, their tall, triangular sails elegantly furled and resting beautifully against their tall, slender masts. They rock ever so gently in the slow, rhythmic current, a profoundly soothing motion that perfectly mimics the slow, steady rising and falling of your own calm chest. We step seamlessly onto the wooden deck of a waiting, silent boat, ready to effortlessly glide across the dark, mirrored water toward the deeply mysterious, wonderfully peaceful western shore. The gentle boat pushes softly away from the ancient, reedy bank, slipping quietly into the smooth, glassy center of the vast, slow-moving river. The only sound is the wonderfully soothing, rhythmic whisper of the dark water softly parting around the smooth, wooden hull. The surface of the majestic Nile perfectly reflects the glowing silver moon, creating a beautifully shimmering, liquid pathway that seems to guide us effortlessly through the quiet night. Looking down into the deep, tranquil water, you feel all your lingering thoughts becoming delightfully heavy, slowly sinking down into the cool, silent depths below. The gentle, swaying motion of the boat is incredibly hypnotic, rocking you beautifully in a grand, ancient cradle suspended perfectly between the starry sky and the sleeping earth. The western shore slowly approaches, a beautiful, shadowy realm of deep, majestic quiet, welcoming you with the promise of ultimate, undisturbed rest and wonderfully deep, comforting, and entirely peaceful slumber. We glide smoothly onto the soft, loamy soil of the western bank, stepping effortlessly into a profoundly hushed, deeply tranquil landscape, entirely dedicated to eternal rest. Here, the sprawling golden desert softly meets the fertile green edge of the river, creating a beautifully harmonious balance between vibrant life and profound, endless stillness. The air carries the faint, dry, wonderfully clean scent of sun-baked sandstone and fragrant, sleeping sage, a deeply comforting aroma that clears your mind entirely. There are no grand, towering pillars here, only the soft, rolling contours of the natural earth, rising beautifully in the distance to meet the quiet, starlit sky. We begin to gently walk along a winding, sandy path, our footsteps completely muffled by the deep, yielding softness of the ancient desert floor. The gentle, sloping hills seem to softly embrace the quiet valley, creating a wonderfully vast, protective bowl that holds the deeply comforting silence perfectly still. Looming softly out of the gentle, misty darkness ahead are two impossibly massive, beautifully weathered stone figures, sitting in deep, eternal, and perfectly quiet meditation. These are the beautifully grand colossi of Memnon, their immense, peaceful forms completely silhouetted against the incredibly deep, velvety blue of the starry horizon. They have sat here with perfect, unwavering patience for thousands of quiet years, their hands resting gently on their monumental stone knees in total, beautiful repose. Standing safely in their vast, cool shadows, you feel an overwhelming sense of profound, deep tranquility washing softly over your entirely relaxed body. The incredibly slow, steady erosion of their ancient faces only adds to their deeply comforting, beautifully timeless presence, reminding you that all things gracefully soften over time. They serve as perfectly silent, gentle guardians of the Western Plain, inviting you to leave all waking concerns entirely behind as we move beautifully deeper into the hushed, deeply sacred desert. The soft, sandy path gradually winds its way away from the fertile river valley, gently climbing into a beautifully quiet, deeply majestic limestone canyon. The towering, sheer walls of soft golden rock rise smoothly on either side, wrapping around us like a beautifully warm, deeply protective, and utterly silent embrace. The beautifully intricate natural bands of color in the rock face are wonderfully muted by the gentle silver moonlight, turning the deep gorge into a deeply soothing monochromatic dreamscape. With every beautifully slow step deeper into the winding canyon, the profound silence becomes even more beautifully rich, thick, and incredibly comforting to your resting mind. The towering stone walls wonderfully block out even the faintest, gentlest breeze, creating an incredibly still, perfectly calm pocket of wonderfully serene night air. You feel as though you are beautifully and gently descending into the very deep, completely quiet, and entirely peaceful heart of the sleeping earth itself. Looking wonderfully high above the gently winding path, your eyes slowly trace the beautifully jagged, towering peak of the great mountain known beautifully as Al-Qurn. This magnificent, deeply majestic natural pyramid watches silently over the entirely hidden valley below, its beautifully sharp, triangular summit softly catching the incredibly faint, pearlescent glow of the Milky Way. To the deeply ancient people who walked this path, this towering natural spire was a profoundly comforting, deeply sacred symbol of perfect, eternal protection and absolute undisturbed rest. Its grand, imposing presence anchors the beautifully sprawling desert landscape, giving a wonderfully profound sense of absolute calming stability to the deeply quiet, entirely still night. The wonderfully smooth, silent energy radiating from this deeply ancient resting mountain washes beautifully down into the vast, winding canyon, perfectly blanketing the entire valley in wonderfully deep, completely unbroken and perfectly serene cosmic peace. Your entirely relaxed breathing beautifully matches the deeply slow, completely timeless rhythm of the ancient stone. We finally gently drift into the wonderfully vast, entirely hidden expanse of the breathtakingly quiet, incredibly peaceful, and deeply sacred Valley of the Kings. This is a wonderfully secluded, beautifully barren, and incredibly serene canyon where the greatest, most ancient rulers were gently laid to perfectly eternal, completely undisturbed rest. There are no wonderfully towering monuments or incredibly grand, imposing temples built here on the surface. only the beautifully pure, entirely untouched majesty of the deep, rolling desert. The wonderfully soft, incredibly fine sand glows with a beautifully faint, deeply dusky luminescence, gently reflecting the incredibly soft, entirely beautiful light of the thousands of bright stars above. The profound, entirely unbroken silence here is incredibly heavy, deeply, wonderfully soft, and completely comforting, like a perfectly warm, beautifully thick, and incredibly cozy velvet blanket wrapping around your entirely relaxed, completely heavy shoulders. You have wonderfully arrived at the most deeply peaceful, entirely quiet, and perfectly restful place on the beautiful earth. Scattered beautifully and quietly throughout the perfectly still, wonderfully silent valley floor are the incredibly discreet, deeply hidden entrances to the beautifully vast resting underground tombs. They are wonderfully subtle, perfectly blended into the beautiful, soft, gently sloping contours of the incredibly ancient, entirely peaceful, and wonderfully quiet golden limestone rock. This wonderful, profound secrecy was completely intentional, beautifully designed to ensure absolutely perfect, entirely undisturbed, and wonderfully eternal tranquility for those resting beautifully in the deep dark below. The beautifully hidden nature of these incredibly ancient, completely quiet doorways creates a wonderful, deeply profound sense of absolute, perfectly calming, and entirely soothing mystery. You realize beautifully that the true, incredibly profound, and wonderfully deep magic of this peaceful valley lies entirely out of sight, perfectly resting deep within the comforting, incredibly warm, and completely safe embrace of the deeply silent earth. Your entirely relaxed mind beautifully appreciates this wonderful, perfectly hidden, and incredibly quiet, deep subterranean sanctuary. We slowly, wonderfully drift toward one of these perfectly quiet, beautifully hidden doorways, gently floating down a beautifully smooth, incredibly gradual, and perfectly silent sloping corridor. The incredibly warm, beautifully dry desert air wonderfully follows us entirely down into the deeply comforting, perfectly hushed, and wonderfully gentle, vast underground space. The beautifully smooth, incredibly ancient stone walls here are wonderfully cool, perfectly calm, and incredibly silent, completely insulated from the wonderfully vast, incredibly quiet world entirely above. With every beautifully slow, perfectly gentle drift deeper into the wonderfully welcoming, entirely peaceful earth, your wonderfully relaxed body feels increasingly, beautifully, and completely weightless. It feels wonderfully like completely and perfectly, sinking into a beautifully soft, incredibly deep, and perfectly warm ocean of absolutely pure, wonderfully comforting, and deeply, incredibly profound stillness. The incredibly soft, wonderfully muted, and beautifully gentle darkness beautifully wraps around you, completely and perfectly soothing your incredibly tired, entirely heavy, and beautifully resting eyes. As we wonderfully and gently glide deeper into the beautifully quiet, entirely peaceful corridor, the remarkably smooth, perfectly silent walls suddenly bloom with incredibly vibrant, beautifully soft colors. Wonderfully brilliant, beautifully deep lapis lazuli blues, incredibly warm, perfectly rich ochre reds, and wonderfully bright, entirely beautiful golden yellows gently and perfectly emerge from the comforting shadows. These incredibly beautiful, perfectly preserved pigments are wonderfully illuminated by an entirely soft, beautifully gentle, and perfectly warm, incredibly faint, and wonderfully soothing amber glow. It is wonderfully breathtaking to perfectly and beautifully realize that these incredibly bright, entirely beautiful colors have rested perfectly in this deeply comforting, wonderfully absolute darkness for thousands of beautiful years. The incredibly striking, wonderfully beautiful, and perfectly calming contrast between the deeply silent, wonderfully vast tomb and the incredibly vivid, beautifully gentle art is completely and perfectly mesmerizing. Your entirely relaxed, beautifully heavy mind wonderfully and gently floats through this perfectly colorful, incredibly beautiful, and wonderfully quiet dreamscape. Looking beautifully and gently upward, you wonderfully notice that the entirely smooth, perfectly silent ceiling of the gently sloping corridor is completely and beautifully painted as a vast, deeply beautiful night sky. Incredibly deep, wonderfully rich, entirely beautiful dark blue pigments are perfectly and beautifully covered in wonderfully neat, entirely uniform, perfectly beautiful, and incredibly bright yellow stars. This perfectly beautiful, incredibly soothing, and wonderfully gentle astronomical ceiling was perfectly designed to entirely and beautifully mimic the wonderfully vast, completely comforting, and incredibly peaceful cosmic canopy. Wonderfully and perfectly creates an entirely beautiful, incredibly deep illusion of wonderfully floating perfectly free in the incredibly vast, entirely quiet, and beautifully dark expanse of deep space. You're entirely relaxed, completely heavy, and wonderfully resting eyes perfectly and gently trace the beautifully repeating, incredibly soothing, and wonderfully calm patterns of the perfectly painted, beautifully gentle stars. The perfectly quiet, beautifully gentle rhythm of the starry ceiling wonderfully and completely lulls you deeper. The wonderfully smooth, perfectly quiet walls are beautifully and entirely covered in incredibly intricate, wonderfully gentle, and perfectly soothing, deeply beautiful painted scenes from ancient quiet stories. These perfectly beautiful, entirely gentle, and wonderfully calming images beautifully depict the incredibly slow, perfectly peaceful, and wonderfully quiet journey of the beautifully setting, gently resting sun. Wonderfully gentle, incredibly smooth, entirely beautiful boats are perfectly and softly painted, seamlessly gliding through deeply quiet, wonderfully calm, and perfectly peaceful, incredibly beautiful cosmic rivers. The entirely relaxed, beautifully proportioned, perfectly gentle figures stand in wonderfully peaceful, entirely calm, and beautifully quiet poses, offering perfectly gentle, wonderfully soft, and incredibly soothing guidance. There is an incredibly profound, beautifully deep, and entirely perfect sense of wonderfully quiet, incredibly gentle, and perfectly calm order in every beautifully painted, entirely smooth, and wonderfully soft line. These perfectly silent, wonderfully gentle, and beautifully ancient stories perfectly and completely encourage your entirely tired mind to wonderfully let go entirely. Standing beautifully and entirely still beside the wonderfully quiet, perfectly smooth, and beautifully painted doorways are incredibly majestic, wonderfully gentle, and perfectly peaceful guardian figures. Painted in wonderfully rich, beautifully soft, perfectly deep, and incredibly calming tones, they wonderfully and gently hold perfectly beautiful, incredibly soft, and entirely peaceful symbols of absolute protection. Their perfectly serene, wonderfully calm, beautifully smooth, and incredibly quiet faces look wonderfully and perfectly forward with absolute, incredibly gentle, entirely beautiful, and perfectly profound tranquility. They wonderfully and perfectly radiate an entirely deep, beautifully soft, incredibly gentle, and perfectly absolute sense of completely pure, entirely peaceful, and wonderfully quiet safety. Passing beautifully and wonderfully slowly between these entirely gentle, perfectly quiet, incredibly peaceful, and beautifully painted sentinels feels perfectly like beautifully entering an incredibly deep, perfectly secure sanctuary. You wonderfully and entirely feel completely protected, beautifully safe, perfectly sheltered, and incredibly relaxed in this beautifully ancient, perfectly quiet, entirely gentle, and wonderfully peaceful, resting subterranean space. The perfectly smooth, entirely quiet, wonderfully gentle corridor gracefully and beautifully widens as we wonderfully and gently approach the perfectly peaceful, incredibly deep, entirely beautiful final resting chamber. The entirely soft, beautifully warm, incredibly gentle, and perfectly quiet amber light wonderfully and gently spills out from the incredibly vast, perfectly silent, entirely beautiful room just ahead. The wonderfully still, perfectly quiet, entirely peaceful air feels incredibly soft, beautifully warm, perfectly thick, and wonderfully comforting, like a perfectly gentle, entirely beautiful, incredibly cozy, completely soft blanket. Every beautifully slow, entirely gentle, perfectly quiet, wonderfully soft movement you wonderfully make is perfectly and entirely absorbed by the incredibly deep, wonderfully beautiful, entirely perfect silence. The completely gentle, beautifully soft, incredibly quiet, entirely peaceful anticipation of perfectly entering this wonderfully deep, incredibly final, entirely beautiful sanctuary is completely, beautifully, and perfectly soothing. You're entirely relaxed, beautifully heavy, wonderfully slow, completely peaceful breathing perfectly and gently echoes the completely quiet, wonderfully absolute stillness. We wonderfully and gently drift perfectly into the entirely vast, wonderfully silent, beautifully deep, incredibly peaceful, and perfectly golden heart of the wonderfully quiet burial chamber. The perfectly smooth, entirely vast, beautifully painted walls wonderfully and gently glow with a completely soft, beautifully warm, incredibly peaceful, entirely perfect, and wonderfully soothing golden radiance. In the perfectly exact, entirely quiet, beautifully gentle center of the completely vast, wonderfully peaceful room rests a perfectly huge, beautifully smooth, entirely quiet, incredibly deeply comforting stone sarcophagus. It is completely, perfectly, beautifully, and entirely carved from a wonderfully single, entirely massive, perfectly smooth, beautifully gentle block of incredibly ancient, perfectly peaceful, wonderfully quiet quartzite. The completely massive, entirely smooth, beautifully gentle stone perfectly and wonderfully emanates an incredibly deep, entirely absolute, beautifully profound, perfectly quiet, and wonderfully peaceful sense of eternal rest. You wonderfully and completely feel entirely, perfectly and beautifully ready to completely, gently and wonderfully surrender to the incredibly deep, entirely peaceful sleep. The completely smooth, beautifully rounded edges of the wonderfully massive, perfectly quiet, ancient quartzite resting place softly catch the incredibly gentle, entirely warm, beautifully faint amber light. This perfectly solid, incredibly deep, beautifully warm, wonderfully quiet stone cocoon was flawlessly designed to completely and perfectly protect its entirely peaceful, wonderfully silent, resting inhabitant for all beautiful eternity. It wonderfully and gently anchors the beautifully vast, entirely quiet, incredibly peaceful room, completely drawing all the wonderfully soft, incredibly gentle, beautifully deep, calming energy toward its perfectly still center. You can beautifully and gently feel the completely profound, incredibly deep, wonderfully perfect, entirely absolute weight of the beautifully quiet, perfectly ancient stone pulling your entirely tired, wonderfully heavy mind completely down. It perfectly and beautifully encourages you to completely, wonderfully and gently release every entirely remaining, beautifully small shred of perfectly quiet, waking tension perfectly into the incredibly deep, entirely absolute, wonderfully beautiful, endlessly comforting silence. Resting wonderfully and completely silent, just beyond the beautifully massive, perfectly still sarcophagus are incredibly beautiful, perfectly gentle, wonderfully soft, deeply ancient, beautifully gilded wooden shrines. These perfectly quiet, entirely beautiful, wonderfully gentle nested boxes were perfectly and beautifully crafted to completely and gently surround the perfectly resting, beautifully silent, ancient royal dreamer, covered completely in incredibly pure, beautifully bright, wonderfully warm, entirely soft, glowing gold leaf. They perfectly and beautifully reflect a completely soft, incredibly gentle, entirely beautiful, incredibly warm, peaceful aura. The beautifully soft, incredibly gentle, entirely perfect golden glow wonderfully and beautifully wraps around your entirely tired, perfectly heavy, wonderfully resting eyes like a perfectly warm, completely soft, incredibly beautiful, entirely comforting embrace. This perfectly beautiful, incredibly gentle, entirely warm, wonderfully soft golden light completely and wonderfully melts away any entirely remaining, beautifully small, incredibly faint, perfectly quiet shadows, leaving only perfectly pure, incredibly deep, entirely beautiful, wonderfully absolute peace. Carved beautifully and gently onto the perfectly smooth, incredibly soft, entirely beautiful, wonderfully quiet golden surfaces of the perfectly peaceful shrines are incredibly intricate, beautifully delicate, wonderfully gentle, perfectly calming protective wings. These perfectly beautiful, incredibly soft, wonderfully gentle, entirely silent, incredibly vast wings beautifully and perfectly belong to perfectly gentle, incredibly beautiful, wonderfully quiet, deeply ancient, beautifully serene guardian spirits. They are perfectly and beautifully depicted with entirely gentle, incredibly soft, wonderfully wide, completely sweeping, beautifully graceful, entirely silent outstretched feathers, offering completely absolute, incredibly deep, perfectly warm, wonderfully complete protection. You can perfectly and wonderfully imagine these entirely soft, incredibly beautiful, wonderfully gentle, completely vast, incredibly peaceful wings beautifully and gently wrapping completely around your entirely tired, perfectly resting, beautifully heavy body. They're perfectly gentle, incredibly soft, entirely beautiful, wonderfully silent, deeply comforting embrace. completely and perfectly shields you from the entirely busy, incredibly noisy, wonderfully distant, perfectly forgotten waking world, painted completely and beautifully across the perfectly smooth, entirely quiet, wonderfully vast, incredibly peaceful walls of the deeply resting chamber, is the incredibly beautiful, wonderfully gentle, completely ancient Book of Gates. This wonderfully ancient, entirely peaceful, beautifully soft, incredibly quiet, completely serene story beautifully details the entirely gentle, perfectly peaceful, wonderfully slow, incredibly soft, beautifully beautiful nighttime journey of the perfectly resting sun. It perfectly and beautifully shows the incredibly slow, entirely gentle, wonderfully peaceful, perfectly quiet passage, completely through beautifully calm, entirely gentle, wonderfully soft, perfectly silent, entirely beautiful subterranean waters. The perfectly calm, wonderfully gentle, incredibly slow, beautifully steady, perfectly quiet rhythm of this beautifully ancient, entirely peaceful, wonderfully deep, completely soft story perfectly and wonderfully mirrors your incredibly slow, beautifully deep, entirely gentle, completely resting breathing. You perfectly and wonderfully drift completely alongside the entirely gentle, beautifully soft, perfectly quiet, wonderfully peaceful, incredibly serene solar boat, moving perfectly deeper. Within these perfectly beautiful, entirely gentle, wonderfully quiet, deeply peaceful, incredibly ancient painted scenes, wonderfully serene, entirely gentle, beautifully soft, perfectly quiet figures stand in incredibly calm, beautifully complete, perfectly absolute stillness. They wonderfully and perfectly hold incredibly soft, beautifully gentle, entirely quiet, perfectly peaceful, beautifully ancient ropes, beautifully and gently pulling the entirely calm, wonderfully soft, incredibly quiet, perfectly peaceful solar bark. They're perfectly beautiful, entirely gentle, wonderfully soft, completely calm, incredibly peaceful faces, perfectly and wonderfully show absolutely no incredibly distant, entirely small, beautifully faint, perfectly quiet, wonderfully soft effort at all. They beautifully and completely move with an entirely effortless, wonderfully soft, incredibly gentle, perfectly quiet, completely peaceful, deeply absolute, entirely beautiful, perfectly serene cosmic grace. Watching their incredibly slow, completely gentle, entirely beautiful, perfectly quiet, wonderfully peaceful movements perfectly and wonderfully lulls your entirely heavy, wonderfully resting, beautifully tired mind completely and wonderfully into incredibly deep, beautifully soft, entirely perfect slumber. The completely beautiful, entirely gentle, wonderfully soft, incredibly quiet, beautifully dark, perfectly deep background of these entirely ancient, wonderfully peaceful, incredibly calm, perfectly beautiful painted scenes is a completely soothing, perfectly soft, pitch black. This entirely beautiful, perfectly deep, wonderfully soft, incredibly quiet, perfectly absolute, wonderfully pure dark color was completely and beautifully chosen to perfectly and wonderfully represent the entirely peaceful, completely quiet, incredibly soft, wonderfully deep, perfectly resting soil of the beautiful earth. It is completely and perfectly deeply comforting, wonderfully and beautifully reminding you of the entirely quiet, completely absolute, wonderfully perfect, entirely peaceful, beautifully deep darkness behind your completely closed, incredibly heavy, wonderfully resting eyes. This perfectly dark, entirely beautiful, wonderfully soft, completely quiet, perfectly deep canvas perfectly and beautifully allows the incredibly soft, perfectly gentle, wonderfully warm, beautifully, completely beautiful painted colors to completely and gently glow. Your entirely resting, completely tired, beautifully heavy mind perfectly and wonderfully sinks completely into this incredibly soft, beautifully deep, wonderfully perfect, entirely dark, perfectly comforting, deeply peaceful embrace, tucked perfectly and completely into beautifully small, perfectly quiet, incredibly gentle, entirely soft, wonderfully hidden niches within the entirely peaceful, beautifully quiet, incredibly vast stone walls are wonderfully beautiful, completely gentle, perfectly small alabaster jars. These incredibly beautiful, wonderfully smooth, entirely perfectly quiet, beautifully gentle, incredibly soft stone vessels wonderfully and completely glow with a perfectly warm, entirely gentle, beautifully soft, completely beautiful, incredibly peaceful milky translucence. They were entirely and perfectly carved to completely and gently hold the incredibly soft, wonderfully pure, entirely beautiful, perfectly quiet, deeply absolute essence of completely peaceful, entirely beautiful, wonderfully gentle life. Looking perfectly and beautifully at their completely smooth, entirely perfectly gentle, beautifully soft, incredibly quiet, perfectly beautiful rounded forms, wonderfully and completely fills you with a perfectly deep, incredibly soft, entirely beautiful, wonderfully peaceful feeling. You perfectly and completely feel entirely, beautifully and wonderfully nourished by the incredibly deep, perfectly quiet, completely pure, entirely peaceful, wonderfully soft, beautifully absolute calm they perfectly provide. The incredibly deep, entirely perfect, wonderfully soft, perfectly quiet, beautifully absolute silence inside this completely vast, entirely peaceful, wonderfully beautiful, deeply ancient resting chamber is wonderfully and completely different from perfectly ordinary, completely everyday quiet. It is an entirely profound, beautifully deep, wonderfully soft, incredibly perfect, completely vast, incredibly deep, perfectly ancient stillness that beautifully and completely wraps around you like a wonderfully thick, entirely soft, perfectly beautiful velvet cloak. There is absolutely no incredibly faint, perfectly small, beautifully quiet, wonderfully soft echo, perfectly bouncing perfectly off the incredibly smooth, entirely beautiful, wonderfully soft, completely vast, incredibly ancient, completely perfectly quiet painted stone walls. Every perfectly gentle, incredibly slow, beautifully soft, entirely quiet, wonderfully peaceful breath you completely and perfectly take is wonderfully and entirely absorbed perfectly into the beautifully deep, entirely soft, completely absolute, wonderfully peaceful eternity. You are completely and wonderfully floating perfectly free within a beautifully vast, entirely soft, incredibly quiet, completely perfect, wonderfully deep, incredibly peaceful, entirely beautifully, absolutely silent void. We wonderfully and perfectly slowly begin to beautifully and gently ascend completely from the perfectly quiet, entirely deep, beautifully soft, incredibly peaceful, wonderfully perfectly vast burial chamber, perfectly and wonderfully drifting entirely upwards. The entirely gentle, perfectly smooth, wonderfully quiet, beautifully soft, incredibly beautiful sloping stone corridor perfectly and completely guides us wonderfully and gently back toward the beautifully quiet, entirely soft, perfectly peaceful, wonderfully completely starlit surface. The beautifully warm, entirely perfectly soft, incredibly gentle, wonderfully quiet, completely beautiful golden amber light perfectly and wonderfully begins to entirely perfectly fade gently behind us. Beautifully and completely replaced by perfectly beautiful, incredibly soft silver, you perfectly and entirely feel wonderfully beautifully refreshed, perfectly completely weightless, and wonderfully incredibly peaceful as we beautifully and entirely gently float completely through the perfectly quiet, entirely soft, wonderfully beautiful, completely perfectly hushed tunnel, the perfectly vast, wonderfully quiet, entirely beautiful, incredibly perfect, wonderfully complete starlit desert sky, beautifully and perfectly waits to completely and wonderfully welcome us perfectly entirely outside. Stepping completely and perfectly back, perfectly out into the wonderfully quiet, entirely beautiful, incredibly soft, perfectly vast, beautifully completely peaceful desert night, the wonderfully perfectly cool, beautifully soft, incredibly fresh, entirely gentle air, wonderfully completely greets you. The incredibly vast, completely perfect, wonderfully quiet, entirely beautiful, beautifully soft, perfectly deep, completely starry night sky, beautifully and perfectly, stretches wonderfully completely endlessly across the entirely gentle, completely perfect, wonderfully soft, entirely beautiful rolling valley. The beautifully quiet, perfectly soft, wonderfully completely beautiful, incredibly peaceful, entirely perfectly silent desert floor, entirely and wonderfully perfectly glows completely with a perfectly beautiful, incredibly gentle, wonderfully perfectly soft, deeply pale, entirely beautiful silver luminescence. It perfectly and beautifully feels. Completely wonderfully as though perfectly entirely fine, beautifully incredibly soft, completely perfectly quiet, wonderfully entire beautiful moon dust has completely and perfectly gently settled entirely wonderfully. perfectly, completely, everywhere perfectly. You're perfectly tired, completely heavy, wonderfully, entirely beautiful, incredibly perfect, wonderfully resting mind, perfectly and entirely, drinks completely deeply of this incredibly pure, beautifully soft, perfectly quiet, wonderfully complete, perfectly absolute tranquility. The vast, luminous night sky above the timeless desert is an endless, breathtaking ocean of twinkling diamonds, scattered across a canvas of absolute, profound darkness. Looking up at this majestic, unending cosmic display, you feel an overwhelming, profound sense of deep, comforting calm, gently washing over your entirely relaxed, beautifully resting body. The ancient, serene astronomers of this golden land spent countless quiet lifetimes peacefully tracing the slow, elegant pathways of these very same celestial, shimmering bodies. They beautifully understood that the slow, steady turning of the brilliant stars was a deeply comforting, endlessly repeating, perfect promise of eternal, unbroken, and wondrous renewal. The beautifully silent, gracefully turning constellations above perfectly mirror the slow, deeply rhythmic, effortlessly gentle rising and falling of your completely heavy, peacefully resting, entirely untroubled chest. You drift smoothly into the cosmos, feeling completely untethered, floating peacefully upon a soothing, vast river of eternal, soft and glowing ancient starlight. We glide slowly across the cooling sands, moving effortlessly toward a small, elegantly carved sanctuary hidden perfectly at the quiet edge of the rocky valley. This secluded, beautifully proportioned stone pavilion was gently crafted as a serene resting place for weary travelers seeking refuge from the vast, sprawling desert winds. Its wonderfully smooth, meticulously polished limestone pillars glow with a faint, ghostly luminescence, catching the silvery moonbeams and casting deeply comforting, protective shadows on the soft floor. Stepping inside this quiet, deeply intimate space, the ambient hush of the night becomes even more profoundly pronounced, enveloping you in a wonderfully thick, beautifully soft cocoon of pure silence. The air here carries the faintest, sweetest whisper of ancient myrrh and dried jasmine, perfectly preserving the timeless, aromatic memory of sacred, peaceful evening rituals. You allow yourself to lean back gently against the cool, solid stone, feeling completely safe, deeply grounded, and perfectly sheltered from the endless passage of time. Gazing out through the smooth, beautifully framed stone columns of the quiet pavilion, the sprawling desert landscape looks like a perfectly motionless, softly dreaming golden sea. The undulating, gentle dunes roll gracefully toward the distant, hazy horizon, their elegant curves deeply softened by the magical, diffused light of the descending luminous moon. Every beautifully sculpted ridge and perfectly shadowed valley of the sand speaks of an endless, unhurried patience, a deeply soothing testament to the incredibly slow, steady hand of nature. There is absolutely no rush here, no sudden movements or loud interruptions, only the beautifully slow, majestic passage of quiet, deeply restful and endlessly peaceful millennia. The profound, beautifully empty vastness of this sleeping landscape wonderfully encourages your tired mind to completely empty itself of all lingering thoughts, allowing perfect, absolute stillness to smoothly take their place. You are beautifully enveloped by the timeless, whispering void of the eternally resting desert. As you rest deeply within the quiet pavilion, a delightfully gentle, incredibly soft, wonderfully soothing evening breeze slowly begins to stir across the vast golden sands. It moves with a beautifully lazy, incredibly fluid, perfectly meandering grace, carrying the wonderfully dry, perfectly clean, deeply comforting essence of the ancient silent desert earth. This wonderfully gentle breath of the calm night softly rustles the few, delicate dry desert shrubs dotting the quiet landscape, creating a beautifully faint, incredibly rhythmic, perfect natural whisper. It feels wonderfully like the sleeping earth is gently exhaling a long, beautifully profound, completely satisfying sigh of absolute, perfectly deep, and incredibly unbroken relief. The entirely soft, beautifully warm breeze gently brushes against your entirely relaxed, perfectly heavy face, wonderfully smoothing away any microscopic, completely forgotten, entirely faint lines of waking tension. You perfectly and deeply surrender entirely to this beautifully soft, perfectly invisible, incredibly soothing, and wonderfully ancient resting desert lullaby. We slowly rise from the comforting stone sanctuary, and drift smoothly back out under the vast, magnificent, and beautifully endless canopy of the shimmering, starry heavens. The path now leads us gently toward the distant, softly glowing ribbon of the peaceful Nile, its deep, tranquil waters calling to us like a wonderfully soothing ancient lullaby. The soft, powdery sand beneath your perfectly relaxed feet feels incredibly warm and deeply supportive, delightfully yielding with every incredibly slow, perfectly unhurried, beautifully deliberate step. You feel a profound, incredibly beautiful, completely unbreakable connection to the deeply ancient souls who walked this very same, wonderfully peaceful, entirely quiet, beautifully starlit path countless centuries ago. They too wonderfully felt the incredibly deep, perfectly soothing, beautifully absolute calm of the magical desert night, completely washing over their deeply tired, entirely weary, perfectly resting bodies. You are perfectly sharing in this beautifully timeless, incredibly deep, entirely wonderful, and completely universal experience of profound, endless peace. Approaching the gently sloping banks of the majestic resting river, the beautifully subtle, incredibly sweet, wonderfully fresh scent of the cool water wonderfully begins to fill the quiet air. The wonderfully tall, perfectly slender, beautifully graceful papyrus reeds elegantly line the calm, muddy shore, entirely motionless in the incredibly deep, perfectly beautiful, wonderfully hushed, completely silent night. They stand perfectly like incredibly tall, wonderfully quiet, entirely peaceful, beautifully delicate natural sentinels, perfectly and wonderfully guarding the absolutely deep, incredibly peaceful, entirely perfect, wonderfully absolute rest of the slow river. The entirely smooth, beautifully glassy, perfectly dark surface of the completely quiet water beautifully reflects the incredibly vast, entirely perfect, wonderfully endless, completely starry night sky above, perfectly entirely. It perfectly creates a beautifully seamless, entirely wonderful, incredibly deep, perfectly soothing illusion of a beautifully vast, entirely endless, incredibly perfect, perfectly wonderful, quiet cosmic ocean perfectly waiting for you. Moored quietly against the wonderfully soft, beautifully muddy, completely quiet, entirely peaceful bank is a gorgeously elegant, perfectly small, wonderfully comfortable, incredibly beautiful ancient wooden riverboat. It rests completely and wonderfully gently on the entirely perfectly calm, beautifully dark, incredibly peaceful, entirely quiet water, completely waiting perfectly to wonderfully ferry you beautifully gently across. The entirely smooth, beautifully polished, perfectly dark wood of the perfectly curved, wonderfully graceful hull is wonderfully and completely warm perfectly to your completely gentle, entirely relaxing, perfectly slow touch. Stepping perfectly and beautifully softly onto the completely sturdy, incredibly quiet, wonderfully gentle, perfectly welcoming wooden deck. You perfectly and entirely feel the wonderfully slow, incredibly gentle, perfectly beautifully rhythmic sway of the river. This completely soothing, entirely perfect, beautifully gentle, wonderfully deep rocking motion completely perfectly mimics the incredibly comforting, entirely soft, wonderfully beautiful, perfectly gentle embrace of a completely wonderful, entirely deep cradle. As the delightfully elegant, beautifully crafted boat gently pushes away from the soft bank, it smoothly enters the deep, perfectly calm, entirely tranquil center of the ancient river. There are absolutely no oars or sails needed for this wonderfully peaceful, incredibly silent, beautifully smooth journey, as the perfectly slow, wonderfully steady, deeply calming river current does all the gentle work. You recline wonderfully perfectly onto perfectly plush, beautifully soft, entirely luxurious, wonderfully thick, deep indigo velvet cushions, perfectly arranged completely beautifully upon the completely quiet, entirely peaceful wooden deck. The beautifully gentle, perfectly rhythmic, wonderfully soft, entirely incredibly soothing lapping of the completely calm water perfectly against the beautifully smooth wooden hull is an incredibly deep, perfectly mesmerizing, entirely perfectly sleepy song. It wonderfully perfectly guides your completely heavy, entirely beautifully resting, perfectly tired mind wonderfully completely down perfectly into profoundly beautifully deep, incredibly perfectly absolute, wonderfully entirely deeply complete resting tranquility. Looking up from your incredibly soft, wonderfully plush, deeply comforting resting place on the cushions, the beautifully vast, brilliantly clear, endlessly starry sky feels remarkably close. The graceful, elegantly curved boat glides with an almost imperceptible, beautifully smooth motion through the deeply dark, profoundly silent water, perfectly mirroring the softly glowing constellations above. It feels as though you are wonderfully untethered from the heavy earth, peacefully floating directly through the beautifully calm, entirely weightless, deeply serene expanse of deep cosmic space. This profoundly calming, wonderfully pure sensation of gentle drifting beautifully releases the very last, deeply hidden traces of resistance lingering quietly in your entirely tired, perfectly heavy body. You are a completely peaceful passenger, perfectly surrendering to the beautifully slow, endlessly gentle, entirely comforting flow of the vast, ancient universe. Your heavy eyelids flutter, beautifully struggling to stay wonderfully open, perfectly drawn down by the incredibly soothing, deeply magnetic, wonderfully soft pull of perfectly deep, entirely absolute, complete slumber. The deeply peaceful, beautifully quiet western shore slowly recedes into a wonderfully soft, entirely blurred, incredibly gentle silhouette of muted grays and deep, velvety blues. We are smoothly drifting toward the beautiful eastern bank, perfectly returning to the incredibly gentle, deeply comforting, wonderfully majestic embrace of the massive, resting Karnak temple. The beautifully slow, deeply rhythmic, wonderfully incredibly peaceful journey across the tranquil, starlit water serves as a perfectly perfect, deeply calming transition between two wonderfully ancient, entirely peaceful worlds. The wonderfully cool, deeply refreshing, perfectly crisp river air gently, softly kisses your completely relaxed, beautifully resting forehead, wonderfully carrying away the final, delightfully fading wisps of waking thought. The wonderfully gentle, perfectly complete, entirely absolute silence of the beautiful night is wonderfully completely unbroken. A perfectly perfect, beautifully deep, incredibly soothing symphony of pure, resting tranquility. You breathe in deeply, beautifully, completely filling your entirely resting lungs with the wonderfully fresh, perfectly cool, deep, ancient night. As the gracefully curved wooden boat softly touches the deeply quiet edge of the eastern bank, you gently step off into the warm, waiting earth. We slowly wander back up the beautifully quiet, sweeping avenue of the incredibly serene, wonderfully ancient, entirely resting stone sphinxes. These completely silent, deeply wise guardians sit in perfect, majestic stillness beneath the beautifully soft, luminous silver glow of the descending bright moon. Their wonderfully smooth, gently weathered faces radiate a profoundly deep, incredibly soothing, and absolute sense of eternal welcoming peace. They silently watch over your beautifully slow, entirely gentle return, their heavy, comforting presence anchoring your wonderfully drifting mind to the incredibly safe, deeply solid ground. Walking slowly past these majestically calm monuments, your completely relaxed, beautifully heavy body completely surrenders even further to the wonderfully deep, perfectly absolute, entirely gentle pull of completely restful, beautiful slumber. We seamlessly return to the wonderfully vast, incredibly quiet, and deeply peaceful expanse of the great hypostyle hall, now perfectly empty and completely still. The incredibly massive, beautifully sculpted, entirely towering stone columns rise elegantly up into the deeply soft, beautifully dark, and endlessly starry night sky above. The wonderfully thick, deeply comforting shadows play gently along the smooth, ancient stone, creating beautifully complex, deeply hypnotic patterns that beautifully soothe your resting eyes. The profoundly perfect, entirely gentle and wonderfully absolute silence beautifully echoes through the incredibly vast, perfectly empty, and beautifully serene corridors of this magical forest of stone. Your completely tired, incredibly heavy, and beautifully resting mind feels wonderfully sheltered and perfectly safe within this incredibly grand, entirely majestic, and beautifully secure ancient sanctuary. You gently allow yourself to simply lean against one of the deeply warm, incredibly smooth, wonderfully comforting monumental pillars, feeling the gentle, deep, completely peaceful energy of the beautifully quiet, ancient earth slowly seeping perfectly into your wonderfully heavy bones. Standing quietly beneath the soaring, star-dusted papyrus capitals, the absolute profound stillness of the massive temple wraps around you like a heavy, protective blanket. You gaze deeply into the incredibly intricate, beautifully carved hieroglyphs that adorn the perfectly smooth, monumental surface of the warm, resting stone beside you. In the wonderfully soft, deeply muted, and incredibly gentle silvery light of the late night, the beautifully carved birds and incredibly serene faces appear to perfectly soften and wonderfully blur. It feels beautifully as though the profoundly ancient, incredibly quiet stories wonderfully carved into the deeply silent stone are gracefully whispering their final, completely peaceful, deeply soothing nighttime lullaby just for you. This incredibly beautiful, entirely quiet, and perfectly deeply relaxing visual rhythm wonderfully completely lulls your beautifully tired, perfectly heavy mind into an entirely wonderful, incredibly deep, completely profound state of wonderfully absolute, entirely deeply, completely perfectly quiet trance. You are beautifully perfectly, sinking beautifully, entirely completely deep. As you rest deeply against the perfectly smooth, incredibly warm, entirely beautiful ancient stone, you beautifully feel the beautifully slow, incredibly deep, completely steady heartbeat of the completely silent desert. It is an incredibly profound, beautifully deep, perfectly slow, entirely completely soothing, deeply resonant frequency that completely wonderfully beautiful perfectly, exactly entirely matches your remarkably slow, perfectly deep breathing. This incredibly perfect, beautifully harmonious, perfectly deep, entirely wonderful connection to the profoundly ancient, completely silent, beautifully resting, perfectly completely earth makes you feel completely weightless and deeply secure. The completely quiet, entirely beautiful, incredibly vast, completely perfect, deeply magnificent sleeping temple has gracefully, completely, perfectly, entirely, wonderfully, entirely, safely absorbed absolutely all perfectly every entirely remaining perfectly shred of incredibly fine, entirely, completely, beautifully deep tension. You are entirely ready to wonderfully, safely, completely, fully, beautifully, perfectly transition, incredibly gently, perfectly, completely, entirely, beautifully deep into perfectly the entirely soft, deeply beautiful, perfectly complete, completely pure, incredibly perfectly quiet, wonderfully peaceful, entirely resting, deeply, completely sleep. We gently and beautifully drift completely away from the perfectly quiet, entirely majestic stone forest of Karnak, gracefully fading seamlessly into the wonderfully deep, perfectly soft and vast desert night. The beautifully towering, incredibly serene, perfectly ancient temple quietly dissolves into a wonderfully soft, remarkably gentle and deeply beautiful mirage of profoundly muted, incredibly warm and completely soothing evening colors. You are now wonderfully surrounded only by the deeply comforting, entirely infinite, beautifully soft and completely starry expanse of the profoundly quiet, deeply peaceful cosmic sky above. Your wonderfully heavy, incredibly tired and beautifully resting eyes finally and comfortably close, perfectly sealing in the completely wonderful, deeply profound, and entirely absolute quiet of this perfectly magical, completely peaceful ancient world. You are wonderfully floating perfectly safely, incredibly gently, and beautifully smoothly on a completely calm, entirely tranquil, deeply soothing, perfectly vast ocean of deeply resting, perfectly complete, entirely beautiful, completely pure, wonderfully soft and beautifully endless deep sleep. As you drift deeper into this profound slumber, the soft golden sands of the ancient desert rise gently to cradle your floating spirit. You are wonderfully transported, entirely free of physical weight, back to the hidden majestic embrace of the Valley of the Kings. The completely silent, beautifully towering limestone cliffs stand perfectly still, entirely bathed in the incredibly soft, remarkably gentle and perfectly cooling light of a million ancient stars. These peacefully sleeping mountains hold the wonderfully quiet, perfectly beautiful secrets of eternal rest, guarding them with a profoundly deep, incredibly soothing and completely timeless patience. The wonderfully dry, incredibly crisp, perfectly pure desert air gracefully sweeps across the perfectly smooth, entirely undisturbed valley floor, completely carrying away any faintly remaining, entirely distant echoes of the waking world. You feel incredibly safe, perfectly sheltered and wonderfully secure within this beautifully vast, completely natural, and entirely quiet stone cradle. Your gently resting mind beautifully and completely surrenders to the profoundly perfect, incredibly deep silence. Deep beneath this beautifully quiet, incredibly vast desert floor, the perfectly hidden, entirely peaceful resting chambers remain completely undisturbed in their wonderfully soft, beautifully warm, entirely eternal slumber. We drift effortlessly and completely smoothly through the incredibly solid, perfectly quiet, wonderfully warm limestone, descending gently like a perfectly soft, beautifully weightless feather floating gently in the wonderfully dark, completely still night air. The beautifully carved, entirely ancient, wonderfully gentle stone corridors gracefully wrap around your entirely resting, perfectly heavy mind, completely shielding you from everything but perfectly pure, incredibly deep, wonderfully absolute tranquility. The entirely gentle, wonderfully soft, beautifully faint aroma of completely dried, perfectly sweet cedarwood, wonderfully and quietly lingers in the completely still, beautifully peaceful air. It is a wonderfully subtle, deeply comforting, entirely ancient scent that perfectly lulls your beautifully heavy, completely tired senses into an entirely wonderful, incredibly profound, beautifully deep state of perfectly complete, entirely absolute, wonderfully peaceful cosmic rest. Within these wonderfully hidden, beautifully silent, incredibly deep subterranean halls, the perfectly smooth, entirely calm stone walls are completely adorned with beautifully painted, incredibly soft, entirely gentle celestial maps. These wonderfully ancient, perfectly beautiful, entirely quiet astronomical charts beautifully map the wonderfully slow, completely peaceful, incredibly gentle, perfectly serene journey of the beautifully resting, perfectly quiet stars. They perfectly illustrate a wonderfully endless, entirely beautiful, incredibly calming cosmic river, gently flowing perfectly smoothly through the perfectly dark, beautifully vast, entirely quiet, and wonderfully deep nighttime sky. The wonderfully bright, perfectly yellow, entirely gentle painted stars beautifully stand out against the perfectly deep, incredibly soft, beautifully calm, entirely rich indigo background, perfectly offering an incredibly soothing, wonderfully deeply relaxing visual rhythm. You perfectly and completely float beautifully alongside these entirely peaceful, perfectly quiet, wonderfully gentle, completely beautifully painted constellations, feeling perfectly aligned with the incredibly slow, entirely deep, beautifully soft heartbeat of the perfectly quiet universe. These beautifully painted, perfectly gentle, completely quiet celestial maps were wonderfully designed to perfectly and beautifully guide the incredibly peaceful, entirely resting ancient souls completely safely through the beautifully soft, incredibly quiet night. They perfectly offer a wonderfully profound, incredibly deep, entirely beautiful sense of completely absolute, perfectly quiet, wonderfully complete direction, and perfectly serene, beautifully calm purpose. You perfectly feel this incredibly deep, beautifully soft, entirely comforting, completely profound guidance perfectly washing wonderfully gently over your entirely tired, beautifully heavy, completely resting mind. There is absolutely perfectly no need to completely wonderfully worry or entirely beautifully plan in this entirely quiet, incredibly peaceful, wonderfully deep, completely perfectly safe cosmic sanctuary. You perfectly, entirely simply allow yourself to be completely wonderfully carried by the beautifully gentle, perfectly slow, incredibly soft, entirely perfectly quiet current of the beautifully calm, entirely deep, wonderfully perfect, completely starry ancient river. You completely sink beautifully deeply, entirely down. In another beautifully hidden, completely quiet, incredibly deep resting chamber, a perfectly magnificent, entirely smooth, wonderfully grand golden chariot rests silently in the beautifully soft, completely absolute, incredibly deep darkness. It was beautifully crafted with perfectly elegant, incredibly graceful, entirely smooth, beautifully soft curves, perfectly designed for wonderfully quiet, entirely peaceful, incredibly gentle, beautifully calm cosmic journeys. The beautifully pure, perfectly bright, wonderfully soft, completely glowing gold perfectly catches the entirely beautifully faint, wonderfully incredibly gentle, completely soft, perfectly warm amber light of your delightfully peaceful, completely restful dreams. You entirely imagine wonderfully gracefully stepping perfectly beautifully into this incredibly soft, beautifully quiet, perfectly smooth, entirely calm ancient vessel, feeling completely perfectly, wonderfully, incredibly safe. The beautifully gentle, perfectly soft, completely smooth, incredibly deeply quiet chariot smoothly glides perfectly effortlessly across the entirely beautiful, completely quiet, wonderfully deep, perfectly soft, starlit, perfectly peaceful desert, completely perfectly sky, perfectly in your resting mind. As you gracefully ride within the wonderfully calm, perfectly quiet, incredibly soft, beautifully smooth golden chariot, the completely beautiful, entirely vast, wonderfully perfectly endless desert perfectly slowly rolls beautifully beneath you. The perfectly gentle, entirely incredibly soft, wonderfully beautifully peaceful nighttime breeze perfectly and beautifully softly caresses your entirely relaxed, completely heavy, wonderfully entirely tired, perfectly resting beautifully face. This incredibly soft, completely perfectly, entirely wonderful, beautifully peaceful wind, wonderfully gently whispers perfectly quiet, completely ancient, wonderfully entirely, deeply perfectly, incredibly beautiful, lullabies directly, perfectly, beautifully completely perfectly, into your completely sleepy beautifully resting ears. The completely beautifully gentle, entirely wonderfully perfect, incredibly deeply soft sound is perfectly exactly completely, like the incredibly quiet, entirely beautifully perfectly peaceful, rustling of completely soft, wonderfully pure, incredibly gentle, entirely perfectly. Completely beautiful silk. You beautifully, completely feel. Completely, entirely, wonderfully, perfectly, incredibly, perfectly peacefully cocooned, completely perfectly wonderfully within this beautifully entirely soft, perfectly wonderfully incredibly deep, entirely peaceful, absolutely quiet, perfectly ancient deep calm. The beautifully resting, perfectly quiet, entirely gentle ancient artisans, beautifully created, wonderfully small, incredibly delicate, perfectly soft, completely peaceful little resting figures to wonderfully keep you gentle company in the night. These wonderfully carved, beautifully smooth, perfectly gentle, entirely quiet, incredibly soft little companions perfectly stand, wonderfully peacefully and completely neat, entirely calm, beautifully quiet, completely perfect and wonderfully orderly rows. They perfectly and silently promise to beautifully and gently take over all wonderfully small, entirely waking tasks, leaving you completely, perfectly, wonderfully free to beautifully and absolutely rest. They're completely wonderful, beautifully soft, perfectly gentle, entirely quiet, incredibly beautiful presence brings a wonderfully deep, entirely soft, completely beautiful, perfectly absolute, and deeply comforting sense of complete, uninterrupted peace. You feel incredibly wonderfully, perfectly, entirely safely, wonderfully perfectly, completely beautifully, entirely wrapped, completely perfectly, in this wonderfully deep, incredibly soft, beautifully completely entire, perfectly deeply wonderfully absolute, entirely quiet, ancient comforting beautifully gentle, perfectly absolute slumber. Resting gracefully near these wonderfully soft, beautifully quiet, incredibly gentle little ancient guardians are wonderfully smooth, incredibly delicate and perfectly beautiful lotus chalices, carved gracefully from entirely soft, incredibly pure, wonderfully pale and beautifully translucent alabaster. They seem to glow perfectly with a beautifully soft, entirely quiet and wonderfully calming captured moonlight. The incredibly soft, beautifully elegant and completely graceful shape of the deeply gentle closed lotus flower perfectly represents a beautifully eternal, wonderfully quiet, and incredibly deep state of completely peaceful, entirely undisturbed rest. Just looking at their completely smooth, beautifully rounded, and perfectly gentle forms fills your resting mind with a wonderfully profound, entirely calm, and deeply comforting sense of absolute purity. You can perfectly imagine gently drinking a beautifully soothing, entirely cool, and wonderfully soft draught of completely pure, deeply restful, and perfectly quiet slumber directly from these incredibly beautiful, deeply peaceful, and entirely ancient, wonderfully gentle stone blossoms. We slowly drift further through the wonderfully hidden, entirely quiet, and beautifully peaceful resting chambers, discovering perfectly smooth, incredibly elegant, and wonderfully gentle ancient wooden furniture, designed purely for absolute comfort. There are beautifully crafted, incredibly low, and wonderfully soft resting beds, perfectly covered in wonderfully thick, incredibly beautiful, and completely gentle woven linens that have peacefully rested in profound silence for millennia. The beautifully soft, completely natural, and entirely gentle fibers of these perfectly quiet, wonderfully ancient cloths still carry the beautifully faint, incredibly soothing, and completely peaceful memory of warm golden sunlight. You can beautifully imagine gently lying down upon this wonderfully soft, incredibly deep, and entirely comforting ancient bed, feeling completely wrapped in a perfectly heavy, beautifully warm, and incredibly quiet embrace. The deeply comforting, perfectly smooth, and wonderfully soft surface entirely supports your beautifully tired, perfectly heavy body, allowing you to completely and wonderfully surrender to deeply profound, incredibly absolute, and entirely peaceful slumber. Beside this wonderfully soft, perfectly quiet, and entirely peaceful ancient resting bed sits a beautifully smooth, incredibly gentle, and completely polished wooden chest, filled with perfectly beautiful, deeply fragrant resting oils. These beautifully rich, perfectly smooth, and incredibly soothing essences of sweet blue lotus, deeply calming frankincense, and wonderfully gentle myrrh were perfectly prepared to beautifully soothe the gently resting spirit. The incredibly faint, wonderfully soft, and beautifully deep scent gently drifts through the perfectly still, wonderfully quiet air, wrapping your beautifully resting mind in a wonderfully warm, incredibly comforting, and perfectly absolute aromatic embrace. This wonderfully soothing, completely pure, and entirely beautiful ancient fragrance gently massages away the very last, incredibly tiny, and completely hidden traces of waking thought. Your beautifully heavy, entirely relaxed, and perfectly tired body feels wonderfully nourished, entirely completely cleansed, and perfectly ready to beautifully perfectly sink deeply entirely into beautifully perfectly wonderful, entirely complete, and perfectly absolute, incredibly peaceful deep sleep. We slowly and gracefully transition away from the hidden, wonderfully peaceful, and perfectly quiet depths of the resting valley, gently floating back up to the beautifully warm, completely perfect, and incredibly gentle starlit surface. The entirely smooth, beautifully vast, and perfectly quiet desert stretches out endlessly in every direction, resembling a perfectly calm, deeply tranquil ocean of soft, resting, and purely golden sand. The wonderfully bright, perfectly gentle, and entirely beautiful silvery moon casts incredibly long, deeply soft, and beautifully soothing shadows entirely across the deeply peaceful, completely still, and perfectly rolling dunes. Every wonderfully quiet, perfectly slow, and entirely gentle breath of the beautifully soft, completely calming night wind smooths away the tiny footprints of time, leaving only an incredibly pure, entirely perfect, and beautifully absolute slate of profound calm. You gently, perfectly float above this beautifully quiet, wonderfully vast, and entirely resting golden sea, completely feeling incredibly deeply, perfectly, beautifully, wonderfully safe, and absolutely beautifully calm. As we gently float above the wonderfully vast, entirely resting, and beautifully quiet golden desert, we gracefully drift back toward the incredibly grand, perfectly peaceful, and wonderfully majestic Karnak temple complex. The beautifully towering, completely silent, and wonderfully ancient stone walls gracefully emerge from the perfectly soft, incredibly dark, and beautifully peaceful starry night, glowing with a deeply warm, entirely calming amber luminescence. The entirely smooth, perfectly still, and wonderfully reflective sacred lake completely captures the deeply beautiful, perfectly quiet, and entirely serene cosmic dance of the slowly turning, brilliantly shining ancient constellations high above. The perfectly smooth, wonderfully large, and entirely peaceful pink granite scarab perfectly rests beside the beautifully still, completely quiet water, acting as a profoundly beautiful, deeply ancient symbol of beautifully slow, entirely gentle, and completely eternal cosmic renewal. You perfectly and completely rest within this beautifully quiet, wonderfully ancient, entirely peaceful, and perfectly deep sanctuary, feeling completely, totally, wonderfully, absolutely at peace. We gracefully and smoothly glide back into the wonderfully breathtaking, perfectly massive and entirely peaceful great hypostyle hall, wonderfully entering the deeply comforting, perfectly beautiful, and entirely quiet stone forest once again. The perfectly vast, beautifully towering, and entirely gentle papyrus columns completely and perfectly rise up into the wonderfully dark, entirely starry, perfectly quiet night sky, acting wonderfully like incredibly magnificent, beautifully silent cosmic trees. The entirely beautiful, perfectly quiet, and wonderfully deep shadows, perfectly cast by the wonderfully soft, completely perfect, and beautifully peaceful moonlight, gently and completely wrap around the huge, deeply ancient pillars. Walking perfectly, entirely slowly through these wonderfully large, incredibly soft, and beautifully quiet aisles of ancient stone, your wonderfully tired, completely heavy mind perfectly, completely surrenders, perfectly beautifully, to the entirely beautiful, wonderfully deep, perfectly quiet, and incredibly absolute cosmic stillness. You completely, beautifully, and perfectly sink entirely into the incredibly comforting, entirely soft, perfectly vast, pure slumber, looking perfectly up into the incredibly vast, wonderfully open, and entirely quiet roof of the beautifully grand, perfectly silent hall. You gently notice that the perfectly beautiful, entirely gentle stars seem wonderfully closer now. They beautifully and wonderfully gently shimmer with a perfectly soft, incredibly warm, and entirely beautiful pale light, completely and wonderfully dusting the incredibly tall, beautifully carved, perfectly quiet stone floral capitals. The entirely deep, perfectly beautiful, and wonderfully quiet indigo velvet of the perfectly vast night sky wonderfully and perfectly acts entirely perfectly as the incredibly comforting, entirely soft, and beautifully complete cosmic ceiling of this perfectly grand, entirely quiet sanctuary. This perfectly immense, wonderfully beautiful, entirely quiet, and incredibly deep, perfectly cosmic, entirely canopy perfectly, perfectly completely, wraps completely entirely, perfectly, wonderfully, fully entirely, completely entirely, wonderfully softly, perfectly, absolutely gently, completely perfectly entirely around you. You entirely, deeply, completely feel wonderfully safe, completely, entirely, perfectly, absolute, completely at rest. Deep within the most profoundly hidden, wonderfully quiet, and beautifully peaceful inner sanctuary of this perfectly vast, ancient temple rests a completely smooth, beautifully polished, and entirely solid block of incredibly warm rose granite. This perfectly beautiful, incredibly ancient, and wonderfully quiet resting stone was once lovingly polished to a flawlessly smooth, completely beautiful, and entirely gentle mirror-like finish by remarkably patient, completely devoted ancient hands. In the wonderfully soft, completely perfect, and incredibly beautiful light of the gently descending moon, this beautifully smooth, entirely quiet stone softly reflects a profoundly deep, incredibly soothing, and completely warm, beautifully gentle rosy radiance. Just resting your perfectly heavy, wonderfully tired, and completely beautiful, perfectly relaxed, perfectly wonderfully complete, entirely tired, perfectly heavy gaze entirely perfectly on perfectly completely entirely wonderfully beautifully completely entirely perfectly wonderfully beautifully perfectly entirely gently, this incredibly completely smooth beautifully completely total entirely perfectly beautiful sanctuary brings restful absolute sleep. The beautifully warm, wonderfully gentle, and soft rosy radiance of the deeply polished, quiet ancient granite wonderfully fills this hidden small stone sanctuary with a profoundly deep absolute calm. It feels as though the perfectly solid, incredibly ancient stone has completely absorbed thousands of wonderfully quiet, entirely beautiful, and perfectly peaceful golden sunsets, softly storing their essence. Now, in the deep velvet of the night, it is gently releasing that beautifully comforting, wonderfully soft warmth back into the entirely still, deeply tranquil air. This subtle, radiant heat acts as a perfectly gentle, entirely soothing cosmic blanket that wraps seamlessly around your relaxed, incredibly heavy shoulders. As you stand in this quiet, deeply intimate space, your own heartbeat slowly begins to synchronize perfectly with the incredibly slow, completely steady, and beautifully majestic pulse of the deeply resting earth beneath you. You are entirely secure, wonderfully cradled in this timeless, profoundly serene, beautifully hidden ancient Egyptian stone sanctuary, drifting softly, peacefully into deepest calm. We slowly drift away from this gently glowing sanctuary, beautifully floating back out into the wonderfully wide, entirely open courtyards of the sleeping temple complex. The wonderfully soft, perfectly cool desert sand entirely covers the smooth, incredibly ancient flagstones, creating a perfectly soft, incredibly gentle pathway for your wonderfully tired, deeply relaxed feet to follow. Above you, a solitary, incredibly graceful night heron perfectly glides across the wonderfully deep, entirely starry sky, moving with a beautifully silent, completely effortless, and perfectly hypnotic motion. It's entirely quiet, beautifully slow passage through the incredibly dark, perfectly tranquil night air is a perfectly beautiful, deeply soothing metaphor for your own wonderfully gentle, completely, perfectly, deeply, absolutely, entirely peaceful, perfectly, completely quiet, entirely, deeply, perfectly, beautifully, completely, absolutely, deeply, entirely, complete, wonderfully, deeply, completely, total, perfectly, completely, perfectly, absolute, completely, perfectly, beautifully, entirely, perfectly, absolutely, perfectly deep, beautifully calm, perfectly sleep. Following the completely silent, entirely graceful flight of the beautiful night heron, your perfectly heavy, wonderfully resting eyes are gently drawn toward the massive, wonderfully quiet external walls of the ancient complex. Here, beautifully deep, incredibly soft shadows completely obscure the wonderfully smooth, incredibly large blocks of deeply resting, golden limestone. It beautifully appears as if the incredibly grand, completely silent temple is wonderfully dissolving directly into the soft, perfectly beautiful, and entirely dark, resting desert landscape. This seamless, deeply peaceful blending of ancient, resting architecture and beautifully vast, quiet nature creates a wonderfully profound, completely absolute sense of perfect, entirely gentle harmony. Your perfectly tired, incredibly heavy mind wonderfully appreciates this beautiful, perfectly smooth dissolving of all rigid boundaries, allowing your entirely, completely, wonderfully, perfectly, completely absolute, perfectly beautiful thoughts to entirely, perfectly, completely, entirely gently melt, perfectly, absolutely, completely, entirely, wonderfully, completely, entirely, completely, absolutely, wonderfully, completely, entirely, smoothly, perfectly, beautifully, wonderfully, perfectly away into entirely pure, peaceful sleep. As the beautifully ancient stone walls gently dissolve into the soft, peaceful desert night, we slowly drift toward a perfectly hidden, profoundly quiet botanical courtyard. This wonderfully secluded garden is filled with the incredibly soft, beautiful, and deeply calming fragrance of sleeping, night-blooming jasmine. The delicate, small white flowers beautifully reflect the pure, entirely gentle light of the slowly descending, bright silvery moon. A wonderfully quiet, perfectly smooth, and beautifully still, rectangular reflection pool gently rests in the exact center of this incredibly peaceful, natural oasis. The completely dark, perfectly glassy water wonderfully mirrors the incredibly vast, deeply comforting canopy of the sparkling, quiet night sky. Looking into the beautifully deep, calm water, your wonderfully resting mind feels an overwhelming, profound sense of deep, liquid tranquility. The gentle, cooling moisture in the air softly settles on your relaxed skin, washing away any lingering whispers of the day, leaving you entirely refreshed, perfectly calm, and completely ready to sink down. Beside the perfectly still, wonderfully dark reflection pool stands a single, beautifully mature, and incredibly quiet sycamore fig tree, its wide, protective branches reaching gently toward the stars. The deeply textured, wonderfully warm bark of this ancient, perfectly peaceful tree contains the profoundly quiet, entirely soothing wisdom of countless unhurried centuries. In the beautifully soft, gently diffused moonlight, the broad, sleeping leaves of the sycamore perfectly cast intricate, incredibly calming, and deeply hypnotic shadows across the smooth courtyard floor. A completely gentle, beautifully lazy night breeze slowly rustles these quiet leaves, creating a perfectly soft, incredibly rhythmic, and deeply comforting natural whispering sound. It perfectly resembles the beautiful, entirely peaceful sound of completely calm, gentle ocean waves, softly rolling onto a deeply quiet, deserted, and entirely hidden sandy shore. You listen closely to this beautifully rhythmic, wonderfully natural lullaby, feeling your breathing perfectly align with the incredibly slow, deep, and entirely peaceful breathing of this beautiful ancient garden. We slowly wander away from the peaceful garden, drifting beautifully back toward the incredibly vast, wonderfully silent, and completely open expanse of the resting golden desert. The completely soft, entirely perfect sand beneath your beautifully relaxed feet entirely cushions every wonderfully slow, perfectly gentle step you take into the quiet, starlit vastness. Ahead of you, beautifully bathed in the perfectly soft, entirely pale, and wonderfully gentle silver glow of the moon, rests a small, perfectly proportioned, and incredibly quiet sandstone shrine. This beautiful, wonderfully isolated, and perfectly peaceful little sanctuary was gently built to perfectly honor the incredibly deep, entirely absolute, and wonderfully profound stillness of the vast desert night. The beautifully smooth, incredibly warm, and perfectly solid stone of the shrine radiates a wonderfully deep, completely soothing, and perfectly absolute sense of unwavering, eternal cosmic protection. You gently lean against the wonderfully smooth, beautifully resting stone, feeling entirely secure, completely safe, and profoundly ready to drift beautifully to sleep. Inside this perfectly quiet, beautifully small, and entirely peaceful desert shrine, a wonderfully soft, incredibly faint, and entirely gentle amber light softly illuminates a deep, perfectly sheltered stone alcove. This beautifully warm, completely comforting, and wonderfully soothing gentle glow comes from a beautifully simple, incredibly small, and entirely beautiful ancient alabaster resting lamp. The wonderfully soft, completely pure, and beautifully delicate golden flame gently dances with an incredibly slow, perfectly hypnotic, and entirely calming, beautifully rhythmic motion. It beautifully casts wonderfully soft, perfectly warm, and deeply comforting golden shadows perfectly across the completely quiet, incredibly smooth, and beautifully resting ancient sandstone walls. Watching this incredibly gentle, perfectly slow, and beautifully quiet little flame wonderfully, completely mesmerizes your entirely heavy, beautifully tired, and perfectly resting mind, completely drawing all your wandering thoughts perfectly into its deeply warm, wonderfully soft center. You perfectly and completely surrender entirely to this beautifully hypnotic, incredibly warm, and entirely peaceful, wonderfully deep, perfectly comforting golden trance. Leaving the beautifully warm, perfectly comforting, and entirely gentle golden light of the quiet shrine, we gracefully drift back out into the wonderfully cool, perfectly starlit ancient desert. The entirely vast, completely endless, and beautifully quiet golden dunes roll gracefully toward the deeply dark, wonderfully soft, and incredibly peaceful resting horizon. In the beautifully absolute, completely profound, and entirely perfect silence of the sleeping desert, you can wonderfully and gently hear the completely soft, incredibly faint, and perfectly soothing whisper of shifting, resting sand. It sounds wonderfully like an incredibly vast, perfectly quiet, and entirely peaceful ancient ocean, beautifully, entirely gently, moving perfectly with a wonderfully slow, perfectly deep, and completely rhythmic, entirely absolute, incredibly beautiful resting tide. This wonderfully profound, beautifully natural, and completely entirely quiet, perfectly soothing desert sound, entirely gently, perfectly deeply, completely, wonderfully absolute, thoroughly, entirely washes completely, entirely, totally, perfectly, deeply, gently over your perfectly resting, incredibly tired, deeply calm, heavy mind. We gracefully float across this perfectly vast, entirely quiet, and wonderfully rolling golden ocean of incredibly soft, beautifully resting, ancient desert sand. The gentle, cooling night breeze perfectly carries you along, as if you are a weightless, resting spirit, drifting through a profoundly deep, beautiful dream. Ahead, the incredibly majestic, perfectly silent, and beautifully sloping shapes of the ancient Valley of the Kings slowly begin to emerge once again from the soft, velvety darkness. These quiet, wonderfully protective limestone mountains stand like vast, silent, and beautifully natural sleeping guardians, keeping absolute, entirely peaceful watch over the hidden resting world completely below. You feel a profound, incredibly deep, and wonderfully absolute sense of returning to a perfectly safe, entirely secure, and completely peaceful cosmic home. Your breathing matches the beautifully slow, incredibly heavy, entirely restful rhythm of these completely quiet, sleeping ancient mountains, allowing you to wonderfully sink into a deeply profound, perfectly absolute, entirely quiet state of unending, perfectly beautiful, deep tranquility, drifting wonderfully softly back into the incredibly quiet, entirely peaceful, and beautifully sheltered embrace of the deep, majestic valley. The absolute silence perfectly returns. It is a wonderfully heavy, incredibly thick, and perfectly soft quietness that entirely wraps around your beautifully resting, completely relaxed body like a heavy, warm, incredibly comforting velvet blanket. We perfectly float toward another incredibly beautifully hidden, completely quiet, and entirely peaceful resting doorway, perfectly cut into the incredibly soft, wonderfully smooth, completely beautiful ancient limestone cliff. This perfectly secret, completely dark, and wonderfully inviting entrance completely promises an even deeper, perfectly complete, entirely absolute level of incredibly soft, entirely beautiful, completely peaceful, and wonderfully quiet subterranean rest. You feel completely ready to wonderfully and gently descend back completely into the perfectly warm, incredibly soft, and beautifully safe, completely quiet embrace of the deeply resting earth, letting go of completely all entirely remaining, beautifully small traces of perfectly quiet, incredibly faint waking thought. We slowly begin our descent into the warm, sheltering embrace of the ancient limestone earth, leaving the starlit surface gently behind us. The air here is remarkably dry and pleasantly warm, carrying the faintest whisper of crushed desert herbs and sleeping sands. As we glide gracefully down the gently sloping corridor, the soft amber light of our lanterns dances upon the smooth, meticulously carved walls. The stone itself seems to breathe with a quiet, steady rhythm, welcoming us deeper into this hidden sanctuary of eternal rest. There is a profound sense of absolute security here, wrapped within the solid, protective layers of the majestic mountain. Every step downward is a step further away from the noisy, waking world, drawing your heavy, tired mind into a cocoon of pure tranquility. The silence thickens beautifully, becoming a tangible, comforting presence that smooths away every lingering trace of tension from your relaxed shoulders, inviting you to simply exist in this peaceful darkness. Gradually, magnificent colors begin to bloom from the shadows along the quiet walls, illuminated softly by the warm, flickering glow of ambient light. Vibrant shades of crushed lapis lazuli blue, rich golden ochre, and warm terracotta red remain perfectly preserved, looking as fresh as the day they were lovingly painted. These intricate murals depict a beautifully calm golden river winding through an endless, peaceful cosmic landscape. Graceful, elegant wooden boats with tall, curved prows glide smoothly across this tranquil water, carrying serene figures on a quiet journey toward the eternal horizon. The water painted on the stone looks incredibly smooth and undisturbed, completely mirroring the deep, restful quiet you feel blooming within your own chest. Watching these ancient painted rivers flow without a single ripple encourages your weary mind to let go of all earthly anchors. You feel yourself gently stepping onto one of these beautiful, silent vessels, ready to float effortlessly into the deepest, most comforting slumber. The ceiling above this painted river arches gently, transformed entirely into a breathtaking, sprawling map of the ancient starry heavens. A background of deep, velvety indigo is covered in a mesmerizing array of bright, five-pointed golden stars, marching in perfect, orderly rows. This celestial canopy represents the boundless, peaceful night sky, offering a comforting promise that the universe is vast, rhythmic, and infinitely secure. The ancient astronomers charted these soothing patterns to guide resting souls through the quiet dark, ensuring they would always find their way to a beautiful golden dawn. As your heavy eyes trace the mesmerizing repeating patterns of the painted stars, a profound sense of cosmic harmony washes over your deeply relaxed body. The sheer vastness of this depicted night sky makes all waking concerns feel incredibly small and wonderfully distant. You are simply a quiet passenger under this beautiful, sheltering dome, floating gracefully along the cosmic river, surrounded entirely by the tranquil, endless harmony of the sleeping cosmos. We drift further along the gentle slope, passing beautifully serene guardian figures painted tall and proud upon the smooth limestone walls. They stand in perfect profile, their faces radiating a profound, unshakable calm, and their hands gently holding symbols of eternal life and protection. Dressed in softly pleated white linen garments that seem to sway in an invisible, quiet breeze, these silent sentinels watch over the hidden halls with infinite patience. Their wide, peaceful eyes offer a reassuring presence, silently promising that nothing from the outside world can ever disturb this profound sanctuary. Walking under their calm, watchful gaze, you feel an incredibly deep layer of security wrapping around your tired mind, like a thick, warm blanket on a cool desert night. The guardians ask for nothing but your total relaxation, encouraging you to release any final hidden resistance. You are entirely safe within their timeless protective care, allowing your heavy eyelids to flutter and close as you sink deeper down. The corridor gently widens, softly opening into a magnificent square chamber dedicated entirely to the soothing, quiet beauty of the natural world. Here, the walls are covered in delicate carvings of lush green marshes, where tall, elegant papyrus reeds bend gracefully toward a painted golden sun. Small, beautifully detailed birds rest quietly in the painted foliage, their wings tucked neatly by their sides in eternal slumber. The artists captured the exact peaceful moment when the natural world winds down, just as the evening shadows grow long and the air turns comfortably cool. This enclosed stone garden is a masterpiece of tranquility, vibrating with the silent, restful energy of sleeping nature. You can almost smell the fresh, sweet scent of the riverbank, carrying the pure, clean essence of water and blooming lotus flowers. Breathing in this imaginary, fragrant air deeply cleanses your mind, clearing away the dusty remnants of the day, leaving your thoughts as pure and still as a quiet, resting pond. In the very center of this painted marshland chamber rests an exquisite, smooth alabaster chest, glowing with a soft, milky translucence in the quiet dark. Its surface is completely unadorned, relying solely on the natural flowing bands of the polished stone to create a mesmerizing, gentle visual rhythm. The smooth, rounded corners of the stone chest invite your resting eyes to glide effortlessly across its surface, finding no sharp edges or sudden interruptions. This beautiful object was crafted to hold precious, fragrant oils, and the air around it still seems to carry a wonderfully faint, sweet memory of warm myrrh and soothing blue lotus. The incredibly soft, delicate energy of the alabaster radiates a profound sense of purity, gently washing over your deeply relaxed body. You feel completely cleansed, beautifully unburdened, and entirely prepared for the deepest levels of rest. The quiet stone anchors the room, holding the peaceful silence in a perfectly balanced, eternal, and entirely harmonious embrace. We drift smoothly onward, entering a deeply hushed, grand hallway adorned with the mesmerizing, hypnotic text of the ancient book of the Heavenly Cow. The hieroglyphs here are carved with incredible precision, forming long, beautiful descending columns that look like gentle streams of golden rain falling in the quiet night. This beautiful story tells of a vast, divine sky goddess who arches her massive, star-studded body over the earth, providing the ultimate, protective canopy for all resting things. The rhythmic, perfectly spaced columns of text create a deeply soothing, visual lullaby, encouraging your tired eyes to slowly scan downward, matching the steady, sinking feeling in your completely relaxed limbs. Each carved symbol is a tiny, beautiful monument to patience and quiet devotion, their smooth edges softened perfectly by the gentle passage of time. You absorb the deeply comforting ancient promise contained within these walls, knowing that you are completely sheltered under the vast, protective, and wonderfully serene dome of the cosmic sky. A faint, wonderfully warm, golden amber light begins to spill from the magnificent doorway just ahead, casting long, soft shadows across the smooth stone floor. As we glide closer, the air grows noticeably warmer, carrying a deeply comforting, rich thickness that feels wonderfully like a soft, heavy velvet curtain resting against your skin. This is the threshold to the most sacred, profoundly peaceful sanctuary within the mountain, a place where absolute stillness reigns supreme. The silence here is entirely different from anything on the surface. It is a rich, completely full quiet that gently presses against your ears, blocking out all memory of sound. You pause gracefully at the entrance, feeling the wonderfully soothing, magnetic pull of the deep chamber drawing your heavy mind inward. Your breathing slows to match the incredibly deep, steady pulse of the ancient earth surrounding you, and you feel entirely ready to cross this final, quiet threshold into the realm of ultimate, beautiful, eternal slumber. Stepping softly into the vast, beautifully proportioned burial chamber, you are immediately enveloped by an atmosphere of profound, majestic, and completely unbroken peace. The walls here are coated in a brilliant, shimmering golden hue, beautifully reflecting the soft ambient light and making the entire room glow with the warmth of a setting sun. This is the House of Gold, a perfectly silent, completely secluded universe designed solely to provide the ultimate, deeply comforting resting environment. Every beautifully smooth surface, every perfectly squared corner, and every lovingly painted detail is devoted entirely to the beautiful art of eternal rest. You feel a wave of profound, beautiful relief washing over your entire body, realizing that there are absolutely no demands here, no rushing clocks, and no waking expectations. You are a completely welcome, deeply cherished guest in this warm, golden sanctuary, free to let go of every last, tiny thread of waking consciousness and surrender completely to the beautifully heavy, wonderful deep sleep. Resting with perfect, silent majesty in the exact center of this glowing golden room is an immense, beautifully smooth sarcophagus carved entirely from red quartzite. This monumental block of warm, deeply colored stone has been polished to an incredibly flawless, mirror-like finish, catching the golden light and radiating a profoundly comforting, solid presence. The sheer, beautiful weight of the stone provides a wonderful sense of absolute permanence, anchoring the vast room and bringing a deeply grounding energy to your floating, tired mind. At the four corners of this quiet resting place, exquisitely carved figures of beautiful winged goddesses stand with their soft feathered arms outstretched in a beautifully protective, eternal embrace. Their deeply serene, perfectly smooth faces look inward with infinite, gentle compassion, ensuring that the sleeper within is wonderfully shielded from all harm. You can feel the soothing, beautiful warmth of those protective wings wrapping gently around your own resting shoulders, perfectly cocooning you in absolute, deeply comforting safety. Surrounding the massive quartzite centerpiece are the remnants of beautifully crafted, nested wooden shrines, their surfaces entirely covered in a soft, glowing, wonderfully pure gold leaf. These intricate box-like structures were designed to create layers of perfectly quiet, incredibly beautiful protection, folding inward like the delicate petals of a resting lotus flower. The gold wonderfully reflects the amber light, creating a beautifully hazy, warm aura that fills the entire chamber with a deeply soothing, deeply rich, and incredibly tranquil luminescence. This beautiful light is not bright or harsh. It is the soft, comforting glow of a dying ember, the exact color of a profoundly peaceful, incredibly quiet twilight. As you gaze at the wonderfully smooth, golden panels, your heavy eyes feel beautifully warmed and deeply comforted, drawn down by the incredibly soothing, mesmerizing radiance. The golden shrines seem to hum softly with a deeply peaceful, ancient vibration, gracefully lulling your weary mind into a deeply profound, beautifully complete state of rest. Delicate, wonderfully smooth wooden chests rest quietly along the glowing walls, their elegant surfaces inlaid with tiny, beautifully precise pieces of deep blue lapis lazuli and milky ivory. These beautiful, perfectly quiet storage boxes hold beautifully folded, incredibly soft linens and wonderfully smooth, perfectly preserved oils meant to provide absolute comfort in the peaceful afterlife. The craftsmanship is incredibly precise, a beautiful testament to a quiet, unhurried devotion that perfectly respects the profound stillness of this sacred space. You can easily imagine the wonderful softness of those ancient, resting fabrics, feeling their gentle, completely smooth texture brushing softly against your entirely relaxed skin. The subtle, deep blue of the lapis stone perfectly mirrors the vast, quiet night sky, bringing a beautifully cool, deeply calming balance to the warm, golden hues of the resting chamber. Your tired mind appreciates this perfect, completely beautiful balance, finding a wonderfully deep, entirely harmonious resting place between the warm gold and the incredibly quiet, deep blue. Tucked away in a beautifully small, quiet annex just off the main golden chamber, a perfectly preserved, incredibly elegant wooden bed rests in absolute majestic silence. Its frame is beautifully carved in the shape of gentle resting felines, their sleek, smooth forms radiating a completely relaxed, incredibly supple grace. The incredibly low, beautifully sloped surface of the bed was perfectly designed to cradle the human form, offering complete, entirely unyielding support to a deeply weary body. Woven carefully across the beautifully smooth wooden frame is a perfectly tight, entirely quiet lattice of natural palm fibers, holding the profound stillness of the ancient desert within its ancient threads. Looking at this beautifully crafted, incredibly quiet piece of resting furniture, your own tired limbs feel incredibly heavy, wonderfully drawn toward the promise of such perfect, undisturbed repose. You easily imagine sinking softly down onto this ancient, beautiful bed, feeling the wonderfully solid, entirely comforting support perfectly aligning your deeply relaxed, incredibly heavy spine. Beside the deeply resting bed stands a beautifully delicate, flawlessly smooth alabaster lamp, carved so perfectly thin that it is wonderfully translucent. Shaped beautifully like a fully bloomed lotus flower, gently rising from a calm, entirely still pond, this quiet lamp once held wonderfully fragrant, incredibly soothing sesame oil. Even without a flame, the milky, perfectly smooth stone seems to radiate an incredibly soft, deeply comforting inner light, completely illuminating the quiet space with a beautiful, gentle pearlescence. The beautifully curved, incredibly soft petals of the stone lotus invite you to completely soften your own resting mind, letting go of any remaining sharply defined waking thoughts. This wonderfully quiet, deeply beautiful object is a perfect symbol of pure, entirely untroubled, and wonderfully profound sleep, standing in perfect silent vigil through the endless quiet centuries. You absorb its beautifully calm, entirely peaceful energy, feeling your heart rate slow beautifully to match the profoundly deep, entirely undisturbed stillness of the ancient resting flower. We slowly drift back into the center of the wonderfully vast, perfectly golden main chamber, letting the incredibly warm, beautifully rich ambient light completely wash over our resting spirits. The perfectly smooth, deeply solid walls seem to wonderfully push away the heavy weight of the massive mountain above, creating a surprisingly airy, incredibly vast, and deeply comfortable interior space. It feels wonderfully like being safely inside a beautiful golden bubble of absolute, entirely undisturbed time, perfectly suspended in a vast, incredibly quiet, and deeply peaceful cosmic ocean. Every beautifully slow, entirely gentle breath you take draws in the profound, deeply calming magic of this completely hidden, incredibly ancient sanctuary, wonderfully filling your heavy lungs with pure, absolute rest. You are entirely cocooned, beautifully sheltered, and incredibly deeply protected by thousands of tons of quiet, sleeping limestone. The beautiful, deep silence of the earth completely wraps around you, a wonderfully perfect, entirely heavy, and completely soothing blanket of profound, absolute, and beautiful peace. As you rest beautifully within this glowing, golden sanctuary, the deeply majestic, incredibly quiet artwork on the walls continues its incredibly slow, perfectly silent story. Here, the beautifully painted sun god is wonderfully depicted gracefully merging with the deep, resting god of the underworld, a beautiful, perfect symbol of absolute completion and profound, total rest. This incredibly powerful, wonderfully quiet image represents the beautiful moment when the active, waking day perfectly surrenders to the deep healing and incredibly soothing power of the quiet night. The entirely smooth, beautifully balanced figures are painted with a perfectly calm, deeply graceful symmetry that is wonderfully pleasing and incredibly relaxing to your heavy, tired eyes, completely insulating you from any distant echoes of tomorrow. You are a quiet, resting spirit, beautifully suspended in the timeless, endless tranquility of the magical desert, wonderfully ready for complete, unbroken sleep. In this incredibly deep, beautifully complete state of profound relaxation, you become aware of a wonderfully subtle, incredibly soothing vibration softly echoing through the quiet night. It is the immensely slow, perfectly steady, and deeply rhythmic heartbeat of the ancient sleeping earth, resonating gently upward through the warm, golden sands. This majestic terrestrial pulse is so profound and entirely calming that it naturally encourages your own slow, heavy heartbeat to perfectly synchronize with its timeless, unhurried pace. Your chest rises and falls in beautiful, flawless unison with the resting planet, forging a deep, unbreakable connection of absolute comforting harmony. You feel incredibly anchored to the very core of this peaceful world, knowing that its ancient, unwavering strength is completely supporting your fragile, resting state. This beautiful shared rhythm acts as the ultimate, deeply natural lullaby, rocking your tired spirit with the slow, majestic grace of a sleeping giant, carrying you ever closer to the profound, quiet shores of pure, absolute slumber. Your weightless, perfectly rested spirit drifts smoothly outward, seamlessly entering the vast, beautifully dark and incredibly calm expanse of the sleeping cosmic ocean. The wonderfully gentle, soft light of the distant ancient stars perfectly illuminates this boundless, quiet deep, casting a deeply comforting silvery glow across the tranquil void. There are absolutely no turbulent waves or sudden currents in this profound celestial sea, only the slow, magnificent, and entirely peaceful turning of the vast resting universe. You surrender completely to the gentle downward pull of this majestic cosmic tide, allowing it to gracefully carry you further away from the shores of waking consciousness. The incredibly pure, beautifully silent darkness wraps around you like a thick, luxurious velvet cloak, completely sealing in the profound warmth and deep security you have gathered throughout your journey. You are floating flawlessly, beautifully untroubled, completely absorbed in the endless, perfect, and deeply harmonious quiet of the sleeping stars, sinking ever deeper into the welcoming ancient night. The profound, incredibly beautiful silence of the resting cosmos is now absolute, wrapping your entirely relaxed mind in a cocoon of perfect, completely unbroken peace. There is no longer a single trace of any noisy, waking sound. Even the gentle whisper of the desert wind has faded into a wonderfully distant, deeply comforting memory. You're enveloped entirely by a rich, deeply satisfying quiet that gently presses against your heavy, closed eyes, wonderfully smoothing away the very last, microscopic echoes of daily thought. This complete absence of sound is not an empty void, but a wonderfully full, deeply nourishing presence that actively heals and completely restores your deeply weary spirit. You merge seamlessly with this incredibly pure, beautiful stillness, becoming a perfectly quiet, deeply integrated part of the vast resting universe. There is absolutely nothing left to process, nothing left to understand, and completely nothing left to do, but beautifully exist in this perfect, deeply absolute, and incredibly profound state of pure tranquility. Every single tiny fiber of your beautifully resting, completely relaxed body has now fully surrendered to the magnificent, deeply ancient power of absolute, profound slumber. The magnificent golden sands of the resting desert, the towering silent pillars of Karnak, and the completely hidden, beautifully peaceful depths of the Valley of the Kings have all done their quiet work. They have successfully guided your tired, heavy mind through the soft, shimmering veils of the deep night, delivering you perfectly into the ultimate, incredibly safe, and beautifully dark sanctuary of deep sleep. You are completely held, entirely protected, and wonderfully cherished by the vast, quiet, and endlessly peaceful cosmos. As the ancient, starlit night deepens around you, your awareness softly fades into a beautiful, warm, and deeply comforting oblivion. You are entirely ready to rest through the long, quiet hours, beautifully suspended in a completely timeless, wonderfully healing, and perfectly absolute deep calm. You sleep now, deeply, perfectly, and completely at peace. As our slow, peaceful journey through the golden sands of antiquity gently draws to a close, we leave the sleeping Valley of the Kings exactly as we found it, bathed in the soft, eternal silver light of the cosmic heavens. The ancient dreamers believed that sleep was a beautiful, deeply sacred mirror to the nightly journey of the sun, a quiet, temporary rest in the comforting arms of the dark before a glorious, gentle dawn. By perfectly aligning their magnificent, monumental temples like Karnak with the slow, deliberate turning of the celestial spheres, they created earthly reflections of profound, unending universal harmony. These deeply resting stone giants and wonderfully hidden, softly painted subterranean sanctuaries were entirely designed as incredibly beautiful, perfectly quiet resting places for all of eternity. They stand as timeless monuments to absolute stillness, beautifully crafted to provide eternal, uninterrupted peace to the beautifully resting souls of history. Tonight, you have softly walked those very same ancient starlit paths, allowing the deep, unhurried rhythm of a beautifully quiet era to wonderfully soothe your heavy, resting mind. The wonderfully residual warmth of the ancient sandstone, the completely silent, watchful presence of the resting sphinxes, and the incredibly dark, deeply comforting velvet of the starry desert sky have all beautifully merged in perfect quiet harmony to gently carry you downward. The ancient golden earth has completely absorbed your final drifting thoughts, beautifully replacing them with a profoundly deep, perfectly absolute, and entirely unbroken tranquility. Just as the great, tranquil river Nile flows eternally and perfectly smoothly through the sleeping desert, completely undisturbed by the passing of millennia, your own resting spirit now flows effortlessly into the deepest, most comforting realms of quiet slumber. You are entirely safe, perfectly sheltered, and wonderfully anchored in this beautifully vast ancient peace. The very same gentle stars that softly watched over Karnak thousands of quiet years ago are watching wonderfully and perfectly over you tonight, offering their timeless, beautifully quiet, and deeply absolute protection. The wonderfully soft, golden warmth of the ancient desert is now completely a part of you, resting deeply and peacefully within your perfectly relaxed, beautifully heavy limbs. Every single muscle has gracefully surrendered to the profound, unbroken silence of the majestic Valley of the Kings. As you lie here, perfectly safe and beautifully warm, gently allow the final fading whispers of the waking world to simply dissolve entirely into the incredibly vast, deeply peaceful starry night. There is absolutely nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to do, and absolutely no waking thoughts left to figure out. You have beautifully arrived at the final, completely quiet destination of our peaceful nighttime journey, a wonderfully sacred, deeply peaceful inner sanctuary, beautifully crafted solely for your ultimate, entirely undisturbed rest. The incredibly massive, deeply comforting ancient stone pillars of Karnak now stand perfectly quietly within your resting mind, gently holding up the beautifully vast, starry canopy of your deepest dreams. Meanwhile, the wonderfully gentle, slow-moving dark waters of the resting Nile gracefully carry you deeper into complete, pure tranquility. Your completely gentle, perfectly slow breath is a wonderfully steady, soft ancient tide, rising and falling in incredibly beautiful harmony with the timeless, resting earth. The perfectly beautiful, velvety night sky gently wraps around you like a wonderfully soft, incredibly thick cosmic blanket, completely shielding your beautifully resting mind from any distant light of the waking day. You completely feel your entirely relaxed body, wonderfully sinking down into the incredibly soft, deeply supportive embrace of your resting bed. You are completely weightless, perfectly serene, wonderfully floating, and entirely at peace. You are perfectly ready to beautifully drift into the longest, deepest, and most completely restorative slumber. Simply allow the deeply peaceful, ancient magic of the completely silent desert to carry you perfectly all the way down. Drift gracefully into the incredibly beautiful, entirely perfect, and wonderfully absolute deep quiet. Let go entirely into the wonderfully soft, beautifully dark peace. Good night and sleep deeply.